Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to the Drawing Room Detectives. Today we find ourselves in the quiet, leafy lanes of St. Mary, Mead, where the roses bloom, the tea is always hot, and murder has a habit of paying the most unexpected visits. Join Miss Jane Marple, the sharpest mind in knitting wool, as she unravels a most perplexing case, the Jigsaw puzzle alibi. When a despised land developer is found shot dead, his three business partners swear they were together all evening, playing cards at the village pub. But, as Miss Marple knows too well, even the most perfect alibi can have a missing piece. Settle in with a cup of Earl Grey and let us transport you to a world of whispered secrets, hidden motives, and the gentle click of needles plotting justice. Chapter 1. A Shot in the Night. The storm that descended upon St. Mary Mead on the evening of October 12th. Not the gentle English drizzle that usually inspired polite conversations about roses and guttering, but a lashing, howling torrent of wind and rain that shook window panes and tested the loyalty of chimney stacks. Inside her neat sitting room on the corner of Old Church Lane, Miss Marple had been doing a jigsaw puzzle, a particularly difficult one, featuring a Flemish market scene riddled with oxen, baskets of indistinguishable vegetables, and at least 5 women wearing identical lace caps. The puzzle box claimed 500 pieces. Miss Marple privately suspected it of exaggeration. It was just past 10 when the thunder cracked so violently that Cherry, her young maid, gave a small shriek from the kitchen. "Oh, it's like the end of days out there, it is!" Cherry cried, peering nervously at the curtained windows. "I wouldn't be surprised if the church spire's been struck again." Miss Marple, who had just fitted the ear of a particularly glum-looking pig into place, looked up calmly. "That happened in 1928, my dear. A Tuesday, as I recall." Vicar was halfway through Evensong when the weathercock came down. Cherry gave a weak laugh, and Miss Marple turned her attention back to her puzzle. She had just spotted a bit of what might be a wheelbarrow when another, sharper sound pierced the thunder, a loud crack, unmistakably near and quite distinct from the storm. Miss Marple paused, one hand on a puzzle piece shaped like a turnip. "That," she said softly, "was a gunshot." The following morning the village was abuzz before the milk could curdle on the front steps. Word had spread, thanks in no small part to Mrs. Price Ridley's impressive skill at overhearing things not meant for her, that Mr. Edward Crabtree had been found dead in his study, shot clean through the chest. The news did not entirely surprise Miss Marple. Mr. Crabtree had not been what anyone would call beloved. A land developer with ambitions as wide as his jowls, he had purchased several properties in the village with the stated intention of modernization, a word that caused great distress to residents over the age of 60. He had torn down 2 ivy-covered cottages to make room for a car park, and was reportedly in talks to acquire a portion of the churchyard for a motorway extension. "'Tis no wonder someone did him in," old Mr. Hinckley said later that morning at the greengrocer's, "though most of us had the good manners not to actually do it." The police, summoned promptly at dawn, were already interviewing the relevant parties by breakfast. Crabtree, it turned out, had spent the evening at home. His housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling, heard him arguing on the telephone shortly before 9 o'clock. By 10, she'd heard the shot, but assumed it was thunder, until she entered the study shortly after midnight, concerned he hadn't called for his usual cocoa. The front door had been bolted, all the windows locked. There was no sign of forced entry. The revolver lay on the carpet near Crabtree's hand, but not close enough for a convincing suicide. It was quickly determined that 3 men had a business partnership with the late Mr. Crabtree, Charles Winthrop, a slick London financier with a penchant for silk handkerchiefs and fast convertibles, Dr. Lionel Graham, a retired physician with an unfortunate habit of correcting people's Latin, Major Hugh Fortescue, ex-army, prone to chest-puffing and brandy consumption, now chair of the village cricket committee. All three men claimed they had spent the evening playing poker at the Dog and Whistle, the local pub, from just after 8 until nearly midnight. Miss Marple, hearing this from Reverend Clement, who had heard it from Mrs. Tilling's niece, who was now courting the butcher's apprentice, merely nodded. "Oh yes," she said, "the Dog and Whistle is very draughty near the fireplace. One would have thought Major Fortescue might have noticed his sleeve was torn, left side quite badly." Reverend Clement blinked. "Torn, you say?" "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "And the brambles near Mr. Crabtree's garden gate have a rather fresh look to them. I noticed them this morning. Quite vicious little thorns." She sipped her tea. "How very odd," she murmured. "I wonder how a man could be in two places at once, unless of course he wasn't." Chapter 2. The Unpopular Victim. By the time the church clock struck 11 the next morning, St. Mary Mead had reached its natural state in times of calamity, quietly humming with scandal. The Dog and Whistle was still closed, the post office queue was unusually long, and the front steps of the greengrocer's had acquired a second layer of loafers, all just popping by to inquire about apples, but staying to speculate, with serious expressions and lowered voices, on the matter of Mr. Edward Crabtree's unfortunate demise. Miss Marple, who never gossiped but often listened, accepted a mid-morning invitation to call on her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose instincts for social temperature were second only to her passion for flower arranging. "I don't want to speak ill of the dead," Dolly said, "but honestly, Jane, if someone had told me they'd shot him years ago, I might have congratulated them." "Privately, of course." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. Edward Crabtree did seem to make a business of being disliked. "He was evicting tenants, Jane. Old Mrs. Pedlow, 87, blind as a bat, and with a gammy hip, he tossed her out of Lavender Cottage to make room for a flipping factory." "A biscuit, Dolly?" "They're shop-bought, I'm afraid," Dolly said darkly. "But yes." Miss Marple nibbled politely while Dolly continued. "Even Reverend Clement said he was a necessary evil, and that was after the harvest supper which Crabtree funded. The man had no soul, just figures and deeds, and that dreadful laugh, like a donkey sneezing." "And what of his business partners?" Miss Marple asked, eyes never leaving her teacup. Dolly's eyebrows lifted with delight. "Now there you have some colour. Winthrop, slick as an eel, and absolutely drowning in debt. There was a rumour he owed Crabtree thousands. Then there's poor Dr. Graham. His daughter was engaged to that young solicitor, Martin Albridge, until Crabtree accused him of fiddling accounts. And Major Fortescue? Oh, he's all bluster and moustache, but he nearly came to blows with Crabtree at the cricket pavilion last month. Something about the old water meadow behind his cottage. Crabtree was going to pave the thing, said it was ideal for lorry access. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Yes, there do seem to be a number of individuals who might have found Mr. Crabtree inconvenient." Dolly leaned forward conspiratorially. "And here's the odd bit. The new housemaid, foreign girl, pretty enough, not too bright, disappeared the very night of the murder. Packed up and left before dawn, left a pair of shoes behind and everything. Police say she's just frightened, but between you and me, Jane, I've always found a sudden departure rather suspicious. Do you know where she came from? Somewhere near Trieste, I think. Or was it Toulouse? In any case, she had that quiet sort of manner that always makes people think you're eavesdropping, even when you're not." "People rarely eavesdrop when you think they are," Miss Marple said. "It's when you assume they're not listening that the truth tends to escape one's lips. I suppose you'll be getting involved." Miss Marple gave her familiar non-committal shrug, the sort that could mean anything from, perhaps, to, "I've already drawn my conclusions and begun my inquiries." At that very moment, in the study of the late Mr. Crabtree, Inspector Grayson was examining the revolver and wondering aloud why the entry wound and the blood spatter didn't quite match the position of the chair. And over at the Dog and Whistle, young Peter Hayworth, who'd been mopping the floors on the night of the murder, was finally recalling that someone had gone out the back door around 10. He thought it was Major Fortescue, but then again, he'd had 2 shandies and might have imagined it. Meanwhile, in her quiet little sitting room on Old Church Lane, Miss Marple returned to her jigsaw puzzle and selected a tiny piece that looked rather like the top of a fishmonger's hat. Chapter 3. Inspector Slack's Theory. Inspector Slack, newly promoted and freshly confident, had a way of carrying his notebook as if it were a warrant. He also had a habit, much lamented in the village, of assuming guilt by volume. The louder the protest, the more suspicious the person, the quieter, the more dangerous. So it was with no small satisfaction that he stood on the doorstep of Mrs. Tilling's cottage that Wednesday morning, flanked by a constable and wearing the kind of expression one usually sees on victorious poultry. "I've got her," he announced to Reverend Clement, who had the misfortune of opening his gate just as Slack passed. "Who precisely?" asked the vicar, adjusting his glasses. "The maid," Slack said with relish. "Foreign girl, no papers, no references, and fled the scene right after the murder, left in the middle of the night on foot. That, Reverend, is what we call fleeing the scene of a crime." "She left behind her shoes," Reverend Clement murmured. "Odd thing for a woman fleeing justice, don't you think?" But Slack was already gone, off to announce his triumph to anyone who would listen. The village postmistress listened, twice. So did the milkman, and, unfortunately for him, Miss Marple, who happened to be purchasing thread for her tatting at the time. "She took no luggage?" Miss Marple asked, carefully selecting a spool of pale blue. "None," Slack confirmed. "No valise, no bag, just up and vanished." "How very curious," Miss Marple said quietly. "One would think, well, if a woman were escaping justice, she might take a toothbrush at least, or a coat. It was raining after all." Slack sniffed. "Guilt clouds the mind." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but fear sharpens it. The maid, when found at a cousin's lodging-house in East Brackley, was more wet and bewildered than criminal. Her name was Anchor, she spoke broken English, and she'd run off because, as she tearfully explained, Mr. Crabtree had been shouting at someone on the telephone the night before, shouting in a way that made her remember a very bad man in her village who had once shot her uncle. Miss Marple, hearing this via Dolly Bantry, who had it from the baker's wife, whose niece worked for the cousin who housed the maid, only nodded. "She ran from a memory," Miss Marple said. "Poor girl." Meanwhile, at the Dog and Whistle, Miss Marple arranged for what she called a completely unplanned conversation with young Peter Hayworth, who was mopping the pub floor with the hopelessness of one cleaning up after a goose fair. "Oh yes, they were here," Peter said, scratching his head as he leaned on his mop. "Mr. Winthrop, Dr. Graham, and the Major came in just after 8, had the back table near the stove." "And they stayed all evening?" Miss Marple asked. Peter hesitated. "Seemed so. I mean, I was in and out of the kitchen, kept ordering whiskey. Well, the Major did, loud about it too, kept saying things like, 'Raise the stakes, man,' and 'another round, blast it.' I don't rightly remember who went to the lav or stepped out for a smoke. Could have been any of them. It was raining hard, and we'd lost a tile from the roof, so there was a dreadful drip near the window. Did they speak to anyone else?" "No, just to each other, except Winthrop nodded at me once and asked for matches." "Did you notice any torn clothing?" Peter blinked. "Clothing?" Miss Marple smiled. "Never mind, dear boy. Thank you. That's been very helpful." Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea and studied her jigsaw. The market scene was beginning to take shape. A fishmonger's stall had emerged near a barrel of indistinct root vegetables. She looked at the small slip of notepaper beside the tray where she'd scribbled Winthrop, debt, Graham, ruined engagement, Fortescue, land feud, Anchor. No valise. She tapped her pencil thoughtfully. The pieces, she murmured, are all here, but they've been arranged incorrectly. Outside, the storm had passed, but in St. Mary Mead, the clouds were only just beginning to gather. Chapter 4. The Torn Sleeve. The Wednesday knitting circle at the parish hall had a rhythm all its own, clicking needles, soft murmurs, and the occasional mild debate over whether the vicar's wife ought to be allowed to substitute lemon curd for jam in her Victoria sponge. But beneath the pleasant domesticity ran a current of information, subtle and untraceable, like smoke from a distant fire. Miss Marple, working a delicate lace pattern in lavender wool, sat beside Mrs. Phillips, the church organist and part-time jumble organizer. "I do hope you've received enough donations for Saturday," Miss Marple said pleasantly, eyes never leaving her needles. "Oh, mountains," Mrs. Phillips replied, nearly dropping her ball of yarn. "People always find things to part with when the bishop's expected, though I must say some of it's hardly fit for man or beast. Torn coats, half a pair of gloves, and someone had the nerve to donate a hat box without a lid." Torn coats? Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "That's unusual." Mrs. Phillips chuckled. "Major Fortescue brought one in yesterday. Ghastly old tweed thing. Said the sleeve got caught on something while he was gardening. He was quite proud of having done a clean out. Brought it in himself, if you can imagine that." "Gardening?" Miss Marple mused aloud. "I'd not taken him for the horticultural sort. Military men rarely are." "Indeed not, but he seemed very set on making space. Something about moths in the attic." "Oh, and the sleeve, yes, it was badly torn. Left side, just here." Mrs. Phillips gestured vaguely at her elbow. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with a soft clack. So thoughtful of him. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll up past the Crabtree estate, umbrella in hand, though the sky was merely sulking now, not weeping. The hedgerows had suffered under last night's storm, and the grass was soft underfoot, but she walked steadily, pausing now and then to inspect a drooping rose or a patch of flattened fern. Near the back gate of the estate, one that opened onto a muddy lane little used except by delivery carts, she stopped. There, beside the latch, was a stretch of old barbed wire where a hedge had once grown thicker. A few broken twigs lay nearby, along with one long thread of brown tweed, caught fast and glinting slightly with yesterday's rain. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and delicately plucked the thread free, tucking it into the corner with the sort of care one might use for a wayward crumb. Not far off, the gardener was struggling to right a toppled watering can. Miss Marple waved cheerfully. "Terrible weather last night," she called. "Dreadful, miss," the man replied. "Nearly lost the tool shed door, and someone left this gate swinging. Right nuisance it was." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh dear, that could have let anyone in or out." She walked on. Back home, the tweed thread lay on a saucer beside her teacup. It was coarse, brown, and freckled with a faint reddish hue, a perfect match to Major Fortescue's well-known country jacket. "Left sleeve," Miss Marple murmured. "Caught, as one might, if clambering in haste through a narrow gate, not long after a gunshot." She added another note to her list. The picture was becoming clearer, but, like a jigsaw puzzle with one piece forced in the wrong way, something still didn't quite fit. The Major had an alibi after all, or was the picture too neat? Miss Marple reached for her shawl. It was time, she thought, to pay a visit to the one person in the village who never missed a detail about men's clothing, Mrs. Partridge, the laundress. Chapter 5. The Fourth Player. The Dog and Whistle was never exactly lively, even on a Friday evening, but on a Thursday morning it was nearly funereal. The chairs were still upside down on the tables, the air held the faint smell of stale beer and damp hearth, and the only sound came from behind the bar. where Elsie, the barmaid, polished glasses with the determined rhythm of someone who had no intention of marrying the butcher's son, no matter what her mother said. Miss Marple entered quietly, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Oh, morning, miss," Elsie said, setting down a pint glass. "We're not open yet, but I can put the kettle on if you like." "That would be very kind," Miss Marple replied. "I brought a little something, Mrs. Bantry's rose-hip marmalade. She insisted I share it with someone who appreciates a proper breakfast." Elsie's face softened. "Well, that's a treat, that is. Come round the back, miss. It's warmer." In the small kitchen behind the bar, over chipped mugs and a plate of slightly burned scones, Miss Marple sipped her tea and asked, quite casually, "It must be difficult keeping track of all the gentlemen when they play poker. Always such a loud game." Elsie chuckled. "Not really, miss. They're creatures of habit. Tuesday nights like clockwork. And always the same trio, Mr. Winthrop, the doctor, and the major. Except they'd never start till they had a fourth." "Really? That's interesting. I thought it was just the three of them." "Oh, no. Always needed a fourth, they did. Sometimes the vicar joined in, would you believe? And once Mr. Hayworth, the butcher's cousin. Not a gambling man, poor thing, lost 6 bob in half an hour. But the other night, the night Mr. Crabtree was, you know." Elsie trailed off and looked uncomfortably at her tea. "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, they didn't ask anyone, not a soul, just went straight to the back table and started playing. I thought it was odd at the time. No one joined them, and the kitchen girl says she saw the major go out for a bit, said he'd had too much whiskey and needed air, but when she peeked out he was gone near 10 minutes. Miss Marple set her teacup down. "How very curious," she said. 10 minutes. Such a long time to clear one's head. "Exactly," Elsie said. But when she came back through later, the major was there again, holding a hand of cards. And Dr. Graham was off in the loo, she thought. Only, how can they be playing poker if someone's always missing? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Indeed, a hand of poker does require 4 active participants, unless, of course, the participants are merely pretending. Elsie blinked. Pretending? I imagine they took turns sitting out, playing the ghost player, so to speak. From the bar or the kitchen, one would see 3 men, cards in hand, whiskey flowing, all very normal. But if they rotated, stepping out one at a time, it would look to any casual observer like a full game in progress. "But why would they?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because when a man is being shot in his study, it helps to appear elsewhere, sipping whiskey and bluffing over a pair of 2s. Back in her drawing-room, Miss Marple carefully added a new line to her notepaper. There is a missing 4th player. Pub staff notice rotation and alibi now questionable. She leaned back and studied her growing notes. The image, like a jigsaw puzzle, was beginning to resolve, not into something comforting, but into something very sharp indeed. The motive was shared, the alibi concocted, but the weapon, the gun itself, had yet to be found. And as she well knew in St. Mary Mead, nothing ever truly disappeared. Chapter 6. The Card Game. Deception. Miss Marple rarely napped during the day. She considered it a habit of poor health or poorer imagination, but on this particular afternoon, with a steady drizzle softening the garden path, and her knitting basket pleasantly full, she allowed herself to sit back in her chair and rest her eyes. What came to her was not sleep, but memory. She remembered quite clearly now the way Dr. Graham had stirred his tea on Wednesday, just after the inquest. He'd said, "It's all very unfortunate, but I dare say Edward was bound to meet a bad end one way or another." Then he'd looked up, distracted, and added, "I remember someone said we were all fated to outlive him, Charles, Hugh, and myself." Strange, isn't it? But why had that struck her as rehearsed? And then it came, like a picture slid into place. a flashback, not her own, but what she imagined must have happened that night. The pub was warm with smoke and laughter. The three men sat around their usual table, cards in hand, half-empty whiskey tumblers sweating onto coasters. "Deal again?" said Major Fortescue. Dr. Graham shuffled with clinical precision. "It's your bid, Charles." But Charles Winthrop leaned back, frowning. "Devilish thirsty. I'll fetch the next round." He rose, jacket folded neatly over one arm, and moved toward the bar, then out the back door instead of toward the taps. No one took much notice. Behind the pub, the air was wet and heavy. A bicycle leaned against the shed, half hidden. Winthrop swung one leg over and pedaled off, head low against the rain. She imagined the routine as if watching a play. Each man had his cue. One excused himself for whiskey or fresh air, slipped out, entered Crabtree's study, likely through the garden gate where that barbed wire now told its own tale, pulled the trigger, then rode or ran back. Not one of them remained seated the entire evening. It had the rhythm of men used to coordination, ex-military, medical, and financial minds, each able to plan, rehearse, and execute. And with the pub as cover, their plan was as smooth as it was cynical. But it required three things: perfect timing, alcohol to blur the staff's memories, and a shared secret no one could betray without damning themselves too. Later that evening, Miss Marple found herself seated across from Colonel Melchett. The colonel, despite having long retired from active service, still bore the look of a man who thought maps and troop movements could solve most things. "You've got that look in your eye, Jane," he said over a scone. "The one that usually means I'm about to be very annoyed." "Oh, I do hope not," she said mildly. "I was simply wondering, during the war, did you ever requisition weapons for estate defense?" Certainly old Crabtree kept a revolver, issued for home guard deterrence, though I doubt he knew which end fired. Did he keep it locked away? "In a desk drawer, I believe. He boasted about the key being on his person at all times, wore it on a chain under his shirt, very theatrical." Miss Marple's teacup paused an inch from her lips. "Oh? And is that key still with him?" The colonel frowned. "No, it wasn't found when the police searched the body, nor in the room. Inspector Slack assumed it had been mislaid. I assumed Slack was, as usual, wrong." Miss Marple's voice was soft. How odd that a man so careful about his key would misplace it, the very night he was murdered. She returned home through the mist, her coat damp and her thoughts sharper than ever. The murder had not been committed in anger. It had been rehearsed, plotted, and staggered across three men. Like a jigsaw puzzle, each piece alone meant little. Together they revealed a plan as cold as it was clever. But now she knew the card game had been a performance. And the cracks in the show were beginning to show. Next, she thought, she would need to find that key and perhaps, more urgently, discover which of the three had pocketed it first. Chapter 7. The Whiskey Stains. St. Mary Mead had seen its share of gossip-worthy occurrences, runaway chickens, misplaced wills, a scandalous flower show judging, but very few involved forensic evidence, which was why Miss Marple found herself sipping tea in the parlour of the much-dignified Sir Henry Clithering, former Commissioner of Scotland Yard and long-time friend. "I hesitate to trouble you, Henry," Miss Marple began, her voice demure, "but there's a detail I thought might benefit from your more modern resources." Sir Henry chuckled. "When you hesitate, Jane, it usually means you've already solved the matter and are simply being polite." "Oh no, nothing so definite," she said, knitting needles clicking softly. "Only that it seems curious to me that Dr. Graham's fingerprints were found on a whiskey glass." Sir Henry raised a brow. "Ah, That's a detail Inspector Slack conveniently buried in his report. Didn't think it meant much, considering they all drank from the same decanter. But not all of them drink whiskey, Miss Marple said mildly. Dr. Graham, for instance. I remember him saying at the vicarage fete that alcohol dulls a physician's hands. He even refused sherry. Sir Henry leaned forward. That is interesting. We lifted 3 distinct fingerprints from a cut crystal glass in Crabtree's study. One set belonged to Crabtree, of course, partial and smudged. The second was Dr. Graham's. The third we couldn't identify, but it was partial, likely the butler's from polishing. But not Charles Winthrop? No, nothing for him, which is odd, considering the glass was half full of expensive Glenlock. Miss Marple set her knitting down. You see, Henry, I think someone poured the whiskey after Mr. Crabtree was shot, and the wrong man picked up the glass. Sir Henry sat back. To fake a suicide? No, I rather think the purpose was confusion. To blur the timeline suggest Mr. Crabtree had a drink just before his death. But if Dr. Graham doesn't drink and yet touched the glass, then he was there, Sir Henry finished, in that study. And not at the Dog and Whistle playing poker. That evening, as dusk turned the village lanes to sepia, Miss Marple found herself walking past the church hall. Inside, the vicar's wife was preparing vestments for the upcoming harvest festival. Folded linens, crisp and white, sat atop the side table. "Miss Marple," called Mrs. Andrews cheerfully, "you've perfect timing. Might you help me sort these?" The Major's old jacket ended up in the same donation box. I nearly gave it to the gardener. Miss Marple stepped in, her expression gentle. "Oh, how careless. May I have a look?" The jacket, once part of a military uniform, was rumpled now, the sleeves still torn at the seam. But it was the inside breast pocket that caught her attention. A faint stain. Amber. And a scent, subtle but familiar. Whiskey? She touched the cloth lightly, then turned to Mrs. Andrews. "Do you suppose many people carry glasses of Glenlock in their jacket pockets?" Mrs. Andrews laughed. "Only the Scottish, and only after a funeral." Later, in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple wrote a new line on her growing sheet of observations. Dr. Graham's prints on whiskey glass. He does not drink. Glass likely moved after death. Major's jacket smells of whiskey. The deception was a jigsaw indeed, but the picture was clarifying. The glass had been handled, the poker game falsified, and now the forensic evidence began to whisper the truth that polite company preferred not to hear. Murder, Miss Marple thought, was rarely clever in the end. It always left behind something smudged. Chapter 8. The Missing Jack of Hearts. It was a quiet afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind that only offered a few small items of note. Mrs. Price Ridley had fallen out with the greengrocer over bruised apples, and the vicar's wife was reorganizing the church hymnals alphabetically, to the distress of all but the most devout. Miss Marple, however, had something far more pressing on her mind than hymnals or apples. She sat in her cosy sitting room, a neat silver tray of buttered scones untouched on the table beside her, and a deck of cards arranged with curious care on the needlepoint ottoman before her. 4 rows of 13, red and black, only 51 cards. She made a quiet little noise in her throat, what a lesser observer might mistake for absent-minded surprise, and plucked 1 card from the top of the drawer pile. "The Jack of Hearts," she murmured. "How interesting." Her companion for tea that day was young Reverend Pritchard, who had a scholarly fondness for chess, theology, and anything else requiring pattern and logic. "In poker," Miss Marple continued, tapping the deck with one neatly gloved finger, "one rarely notices if a single card is gone, not unless one's dealt it, or missing it at a rather critical moment." The Reverend leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "And if it were missing?" It would throw off the entire game, especially if one were bluffing, or one weren't actually playing a full hand at all. Earlier that morning, at Miss Marple's gentle urging, Sir Henry Clithering had quietly arranged a visit to the Dog and Whistle's back room, the scene of the alleged poker alibi. The deck in question was kept behind the bar, same as always, slightly worn, sticky-edged, the kind used more for tradition than competition. And yet, when Miss Marple spread them out with the same tidy precision as in her parlour, something was amiss. 51 cards, she said softly, and not a joker in sight. It was the Jack of Hearts that was missing. That same evening, Sergeant Weatherby arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with an expression that suggested he was being slowly educated against his will. "Clithering says you wanted this delivered direct, ma'am." He handed her a clear envelope, its contents visible in the light of her lamp, a single playing card, edges curled from moisture, a faint smudge of black dust near the face. The Jack of Hearts. "Where was it found?" she asked, though she already suspected. Inside Mr. Winthrop's overcoat, back of his wardrobe. He claimed no idea how it got there. "I dare say he doesn't," Miss Marple replied dryly, "though he ought to remember slipping it in after the murder." Sergeant Weatherby blinked. "Beg pardon?" She looked up, eyes bright. "The Jack of Hearts, Sergeant. It's a clever little symbol. In some circles, it's a sign of treachery masked by charm. But more to the point, it was never meant to be seen again. It was likely used to muffle the shot. But why that card? Because it was handy, because it wouldn't be missed from the deck during a drunken game, and because Mr. Winthrop, for all his cleverness, didn't want to discard it where it could be found by someone sweeping up the pub floor. She held the card closer to the lamp. The powder burns are quite distinct. That card was in the room when the gun was fired. As the sergeant left, muttering something about "how does she do it," Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her thoughts calm and precise. A fake alibi, a shifting glass, a card gone missing, small things, all of them. But murder, she believed, was never tidy, not even when planned by men in suits and clubs. She reached for her knitting, casting on another row of soft blue wool. Soon the final piece would fall into place, she thought. Chapter 9. The Confession. The parlour at Mead Cottage had never seen such distinguished company, nor, Miss Marple suspected, such nervous company. The three gentlemen seated uncomfortably in her floral upholstered chairs were used to club-rooms and brandy decanters, not tea, served from a rose-patterned pot beneath the watchful eyes of lace doilies and china cats. "I do so appreciate your coming," Miss Marple said brightly, passing a plate of seed cake. "It occurred to me, you see, that I had an old parlour game that might help me sort something out." Charles Winthrop, ever smooth in a cravat and expression, smiled thinly. "A game, Miss Marple?" "Oh, yes," she chirped. "It involves knitting needles. One uses them as props. Guns, if you like." Dr. Graham coughed into his hand. Major Fortescue, who had already consumed 2 slices of cake, looked vaguely alarmed. "Bit morbid, what?" Miss Marple rose, moving toward the fireplace where her basket of wool lay. She picked up 3 needles, 1 for each gentleman. "Now," she said, "let's imagine Mr. Crabtree is seated here in his study chair. The first gentleman excuses himself from the pub game, perhaps for whiskey." She handed the first needle to Winthrop. He accepted it with a bland smile. "The second goes out later, perhaps to check if the first is delayed." A needle for Major Fortescue. The Major shifted in his seat. "And the third," Miss Marple turned to Dr. Graham, pressing the last needle gently into his hand, "remains behind to bluff with the cards, hoping no one notices the rotation." The silence was thick enough to cut. Miss Marple sat again, hands folded. A clever scheme, except for one thing. It required absolute trust. And the moment one of you panicked, why, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. She reached toward her side table and retrieved the Jack of Hearts, now clean and sealed in a small envelope. Which brings us to this, found in Mr. Winthrop's coat, used, I believe, to muffle the shot. Dr. Graham's hands trembled. He began, then stopped. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. You see, I don't think you wanted to do it, but someone had to pull the trigger. Winthrop had debts. Fortescue hated Crabtree for the land dispute. But you, Doctor, you had no motive strong enough, not unless someone convinced you you'd already gone too far to back out. Graham's eyes filled. It was Winthrop's idea. He said we'd all hang if we didn't stick together. Winthrop stood abruptly. Oh, for heaven's sake, Lionel! Dr. Graham buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple sighed. As I thought, a conspiracy of fear, not greed. How unfortunate. If only one of you had simply walked away. Major Fortescue rose too, face flushed. We should have done it differently, he muttered. Miss Marple gave him a sharp look. You should not have done it at all, Major. Mr. Crabtree may have been a wretched man, but murder is still murder. Sir Henry Clithering stepped in quietly from the hallway, his coat still damp from the garden. I believe we've heard enough. He nodded to the two constables who had been waiting just outside. Miss Marple rose and quietly cleared the teacups, her back turned to the small sounds of handcuffs and shuffling steps. Later, as dusk softened the village lanes, she sat down by the hearth with a fresh cup of tea. The Jack of Hearts lay on the mantel now, a reminder of the game that had ended in ruin. She looked at it thoughtfully. Murder, she said softly, is never tidy, but truth has a way of laying all cards on the table. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. Rain tapped lightly against the panes of Mead cottage as Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the events of the afternoon still echoing in her mind. She had never taken joy in the unravelling of a crime. There was always something rather sad about seeing clever men reduced to frightened children when truth finally walked into the room, but there was still one small thread left dangling. That evening, she asked Sir Henry Clithering to join her for supper. He brought a modest bottle of claret and a quiet look of satisfaction, though he knew better than to declare the case neatly wrapped. You still have your knitting out, he noted, settling into the armchair by the fire. Miss Marple glanced down at the soft wool in her lap. One should never put the needles away until the pattern is complete. Sir Henry poured 2 glasses. The confession was strong enough for the Crown, Jane. I've rarely seen Slack look so smug. Oh, yes, she said. But there is a difference between confession and motive. What puzzles me still is why Dr. Graham agreed to fire the shot at all. Sir Henry frowned. Fear, wasn't it? Guilt by association? No, that man has healed men under fire. Fear alone would not compel him. She reached for her basket and pulled out a single envelope. Look at this. It was a faded letter found in the back drawer of Crabtree's writing desk, overlooked in the initial search. Miss Marple had noticed it while visiting the house on a small errand the day after the arrest. Sir Henry read it silently. It was written in a scrawled hand, Crabtree's, dated 2 weeks prior to his murder. It was addressed to one Mr. Ellis Whitcomb, solicitor. The contents were short but potent. I've made up my mind to dissolve the partnership. Let them sue me if they wish. Fortescue's too much of a coward, Winthrop owes too much, and Graham, well, he can go back to healing old ladies. I've found another backer for the factory, and I'll have no more of their dithering. Sir Henry whistled under his breath. He planned to cut them out entirely. Exactly, Miss Marple said. Dr. Graham didn't kill out of fear. He killed because he thought everything he'd built, his family's future, his daughter's stability, was about to be destroyed. And Winthrop used that. That is what makes him the worst of the lot. She took a sip of tea and folded the letter. Graham confessed, but Winthrop orchestrated. And the Major, though angry, would have walked away had the other two not drawn him into their twisted fellowship of guilt. Sir Henry nodded slowly. A triangle of motive, ruin, pride, and fear. Remarkable. I've always found, Miss Marple said, setting her teacup down with a soft clink, that evil is rarely complicated. It merely dresses itself in the confusion of others. Sir Henry lifted his glass. To truth, then, found in brambles, bar tabs, and playing cards. And knitting, she added gently. One mustn't forget the power of a simple dropped stitch. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled low, the storm outside moving further down the hills. Epilogue. Quiet patterns. Life in St. Mary Mead, as it so often did, returned to its usual rhythm. The scandals surrounding Mr. Edward Crabtree's untimely end had dwindled to the sort of topic only murmured over teacups or murmured beside the parish flower-beds. The Dog and Whistle now spoke more of the upcoming cricket fixtures than of murder, and Mrs. Bantry had already moved on to speculating which neighbour was pilfering her chrysanthemums. In her cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat by the front window in her favourite armchair, knitting laid gently in her lap, a small dish of seed cake untouched beside her. Outside, the early afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting patterned shadows that danced over the carpet like ripples across calm water. She reached for the nearly finished jigsaw puzzle on her side table, a pastoral scene with a thatched cottage, a pond, and a scattering of ducks. There were only 3 pieces left. One by one she placed them. Click, the fence post. Click, the duck's wing. Click, the final corner of sky. She sat back, not triumphant, merely content. There was a quiet joy in completing something where each piece had its place, each odd shape a necessity. Murder, she reflected, was not so different. Most people believed it was a sudden thing, loud and chaotic, but more often than not it was slow to build, inevitable, the result of many small choices fitting together until there was no space left but for the end. The puzzle complete, Miss Marple folded her hands and gazed out across the lane, where sparrows hopped and a bicycle bell rang faintly in the distance. There would be another garden show next week, and her new rose cuttings were coming along nicely. She smiled to herself. Some puzzles, thankfully, did not end in murder, and with that, the afternoon light faded just a little, and the stillness of St. Mary Mead resumed its gentle hold.